Everything that we have in this country, all of the blessings, the wonderful things that have been accomplished, all are a result of a very thin strand of thread connecting us to the old world. And it was just a handful of men and women and children of faith who came here from England and settled this place. And of course, those were the pilgrims. And they had come to understand that the Church of England had fallen so far and was so corrupt that there was no way of restoring or repairing it, certainly not in their lifetime. There were Puritans who stayed in England who thought they could still purify the church, and then several decades later, they wound up coming to the same conclusion as the Pilgrims and likewise came here. But that most important settlement that happened at Cape Cod at Plymouth Rock was done by this handful of incredibly brave men, women, and children of faith. And so today, what I want to talk about is how God preserved them and how God took this very, very fragile seed of new life, planted it here, and why it began to flourish. Well, on the trip just from Leyden, Holland, which is where they had initially fled England, back to England, they encountered massive difficulties. They had to go back to England in order to take the Mayflower from England here to America. And so in 1609, when they were first fleeing the punishment of King James, they were viewed as separatists. They actually would have risked their lives and potentially lost their lives had they stayed in England. Well, as they first fled the punishment of King James and they sailed to Holland, thinking that that was a reasonable place for them to go, and they hoped that they would find a place there where they could worship God freely. And on that journey, a massive storm arose. They were most concerned about sinking. They were driven way off course. They went far into the North Atlantic, just off the coast of Norway, and they were convinced that they were indeed sinking. And according to William Bradford, who kept a diary that has been of immeasurable help to historians, he wrote this. He said, "When the water ran into their mouths and ears, the captain and crew gave up, and they shouted, 'We sink, we sink.' Well, the pilgrims turned to God, and they prayed to God, and they said this, 'Yet, Lord, thou can save, yet, Lord, thou can save.' And indeed he did. And then they saw the very first miracle. The wind died down almost immediately, and they were able to slowly tack back to Holland. Had this not happened, there would have been no pilgrims to cross the Atlantic in 1620, and the settlement that occurred in Cape Cod never would have happened. Well, ultimately, they gave up on Holland, and they gave up because they were working 13 to 15 hours a day. Bradford writes they were growing old before their time. They were concerned their children were being drawn into the more secular pursuits and mindsets of the people there in Holland, and they concluded they had to go somewhere else. And so they made arrangements to get two ships, the Mayflower and the Speedwell, to carry their people to America. The ships that they got were fairly old, and they went to their local used ship dealer, and really, actually, they worked through an individual who was an adventurer. His name was Thomas Weston. Wetson, and he was able to secure the ships for them. They pretty much poured all the money they had into acquiring the passage to America. And part of the arrangement was that they would become indentured servants for 7 years. And many of the pilgrims were not really happy about that, but they were willing to really suffer almost any indignity just to get to a place where they could worship freely. And so they started out with the 2 ships, and twice the Speedwell had to head back. It was taking on water so badly. And they ultimately wound up packing most of the people, although not all, into the Mayflower and heading off again. And the people were below decks throughout virtually all of the journey. Now, typically the journey might take as little as a few weeks. In their case, it took almost 4 months. The North Atlantic was facing incredible storms. It stormed almost the entire way. They encountered gale force winds over and over. And so the captain, Captain Jones, insisted that they all stay below decks. And as they were there, they were really essentially trapped, and it was 103 people in an area about the same size as a volleyball court. When I was a Cub Scout in New Jersey, the Mayflower II, a replica of the Mayflower, had been docked in Hoboken, and we went to see it. And I can remember it very well. And I was stunned at how tiny an area the people were all in. I mean, it was a tiny ship. It was not a big ship at all. And they were below decks. And as they were there going through this storm day after day, they heard a massive cracking, booming sound. And that was the main beam that supported the main mast, and it had cracked. And if that were not repaired, the ship would ultimately sink. The crew tried to repair it, and they failed. They tried over and again. And one of the pilgrims suggested that a psalm be sung, and they sang the 23rd Psalm. Well, they had their strongest men aboard, and what you see here is an excerpt from a great book. If you've not read it, it's very worthwhile reading, called One Small Candle, The Pilgrim's First Year in America. And let me just read this. The strongest men aboard, John Alden, the blasphemous boatswain's mate, and a half dozen others, put their shoulders to the job while the freezing water poured down on them. Now, let me mention that only 50 of the people on board were pilgrims. The others were, some were crew, some were individuals who wanted to go to America for other reasons, typically to make their fortune. But Alden was part of the crew and not a particularly nice guy. And so they put their shoulders to the job while the freezing water poured down on them. But it was like trying to raise the roof beam of a house. The massive piece of timber only sagged a little more. A spare beam was dragged up from the hold, and the men tried using that as a ram, and again, failure. And then you had a little miracle. Somebody remembered a great iron screw that they had bought in Holland to help them raise houses in the New World. Now, I have read in other histories that it was a printing press, but nonetheless, it was a screw, and you can see in the upper left-hand side there what it likely looked like, if indeed it was the type of screw for raising houses and raising beams. And they put that in place. And grunting and gasping, they lugged the screw up to the gun deck, placed it under the ruined beam, and then, of course, they set the beam in place. And so they now were in a situation where the jack screw had worked, the ship was miraculously saved, They were about halfway across the Atlantic. So the immediate danger was past, but then there was the concern, would this hold? And also, would they have other issues? It had been a tough journey to begin with. And so the crew wanted the captain to head back to England or to find some other port and not continue on. And so let me read again from One Small Candle. This was a question that Captain Jones and his mates must decide, and they retired to their cabin for a conference. On the gun deck, the carpenter and some sailors put additional braces under the cracked beam, and from their mutterings, it soon became obvious to the passengers that survival was by no means certain. There was great distraction and difference of opinion amongst the mariners themselves, and that's from William Bradford's journal. Some were for going forward, some were not. But if they turned back now, halfway over, they would break their contract, forfeit their wages, and it was almost as long one way as the other. Nonetheless, there were some still for turning back, because in Bradford's words, they were loath to hazard their lives too desperately. So, William Bradford says, they committed themselves to the will of God and resolved to proceed. Okay, so this was a tough journey. They had been out now for almost a month and a half, and they encountered this. And now they continued on. And so the crew, against actually many of the crew's wishes, was pretty much forced to go forward. Well, they were stuck below decks for the entire voyage. Day after day, they asked the captain or one of the mates if they could go up on deck, and the answer was always, no, that's too dangerous. The seas were still running as high as the poop. Even with lifelines strung, we read, the crew had to watch the water or go overboard. So the voyagers were condemned to more hours in the foul darkness of the gun deck. 100 people crowded into a space not much roomier in total square feet than a modern house, unable to change their clothes or wash for over 13 weeks now, with freezing seawater sloshing and dripping around them until everyone was permanently damp and chilled. Not at all a fun thing. And then another little miracle happened. After 7 weeks of the hell of being trapped in a rolling, stinking, poorly lighted, sweat-soaked hell, John Howland, who was a servant to one of the pilgrims, could no longer stand the stench of his forced confinement below decks. And so, violating Captain Jones's order, and Elder Brewster also ordered this, he opened the hatch. When he opened the hatch, then he was able to make his way onto the main deck. And within less than a minute, he was swept over the side. One of the accounts says that he was standing there and suddenly the ship was 20 feet below him, as the waves went up and down. He hit the freezing water, and then this ship had heeled so far over to the starboard that its spars were dragging in the water. Its rigging was dragging in the water. And one of the ropes from the ship snaked across his hand, and he just grabbed on. He was frantic, and you read the account of it, and he expected to die. Well, it's unknown how long he was in the water, but when he was hauled aboard, he was blue and not responsive. He was sick for 7 days, but then he ultimately recovered fully, and he stayed below decks, as you might imagine, for the rest of the voyage. A little miracle. He should have died. The Navy says if you're in that type of water for more than 4 minutes, you die. Well, in fact, only one person died on the voyage to America. It was another servant named William Batten, who refused to drink the lemon juice that they were required to drink in order to avoid getting scurvy, and he indeed died of scurvy and was buried at sea. Well, they landed off course, but that was exactly the right spot planned by God. And so God was guiding them providentially to Cape Cod and to Plymouth Rock. Operating under the charter of Thomas Weston and the Virginia Company, the Pilgrims were permitted only to colonize an area in northern Virginia. If they wound up north of that, they could go as far north as Westchester, New York, or the modern Westchester, New York. And it was interesting. The Virginia Company was divided into two halves, a southern half and a northern half. Their contract was really for the southern half, and they not only missed that, they missed the northern portion of the charter of the Virginia Company. And so, having been blown off course by the storms, they landed instead, as you know, at Cape Cod. Now, at that point, they were no longer under the jurisdiction of the Virginia Company or anyone else. So they recognized that there was a real problem. Some of the crew was making it very clear that they were now under no law and could do anything they wanted. And so William Bradford later on wrote that several strangers made discontented and mutinous speeches. So you can imagine what it was like. This was a real problem. They didn't know what was going to happen. And of course, many of these folks had been locked up in the hold now for the better part of 3 months. They're offshore and, about to land. They knew where they were. And so there were some who thought that they should try to head the ship south, which would have meant perhaps several more weeks on the high seas. There were others who thought they should land right away. And you had members of the crew threatening to mutiny and just take it over and just do whatever they wanted. So fearing mutiny, they Bradford and Brewster, another elder, quickly put together an agreement. Well, the agreement they put together was based on an agreement that they had used 10 years earlier when they set up the colony in Holland. And it was the agreement that they used that was effectively their church constitution. And of course, what they wrote down, they had no idea that this was going to have historical significance. They were just trying to deal with the immediate problem at hand. And it is what became the Mayflower Compact, or it ultimately was called the Mayflower Compact. They didn't call it that. And it became the first time in recorded history that a group of free men had voluntarily and without any coercion formed their own civil government. Well, had they not been blown off course, there would have been no Mayflower Compact because they would have been under the jurisdiction of the Virginia Company. And so here they were, unchartered, without any right to be where they were, under no one's jurisdiction, and they came up with a way to govern themselves. This is the very first we the people type of a document. The Mayflower Compact is there on the screen in front of you, and it was modeled after their constitution for their church. And it says this: "In the name of God, amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign, Lord King James, by the grace of God, of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, Defender of the Faith, etc., having undertaken, for the glory of God and advancements of the Christian faith, and the honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents, solemnly and mutually, in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic, for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience." Now, what you see on the right-hand side where it says the Mayflower Compact, that little picture, that's not the real Mayflower Compact. The only true wording we have of it is from Bradford's journal, but we do know who signed it. And almost all the men signed it. There were a few who did not. Certainly all the pilgrims signed it, and most of the crew, so that people generally were under the compact, even if they didn't sign it. Then you had another miracle. The land was prepared for them. So they ventured inland, they landed, they ventured inland, and they found about 50 acres of tilled land that appeared to be an Indian farm, but there were no Indians. And this was a mystery that they encountered early on. There were no Indians, no local Indians. Ultimately, they discovered there was a tribe about 50 miles away, and they also discovered that that tribe had dug down and placed stores of food, mostly corn, but other things as well, underground. And they dug up those stores of food, knowing it was somebody else's, but planning at some point to repay the Indians. They determined it was the Indians' food. But there was this mystery of what had happened to the Indians who had farmed the land. And so here we read another quote from one of the books about this. They found the stubble of a harvested cornfield, strawberry and grapevines, and a great store of abundantly laden walnut trees. They marched on and came upon 2 more well-gleaned cornfields, and then a place where a house had been, and 4 or 5 old planks laid together. This probably was from prior ships that had landed in that area. They also found another huge basket full of very fair corn of this year, some 36 goodly ears of corn, some yellow and some red, and others mixed with blue. Well, it turns out the land had been inhabited by the Patuxet tribe until it was wiped out by a plague 4 years earlier. Other tribes thought the land was cursed because the Indians there had died from this plague, so they didn't contest the pilgrims farming it. They didn't want it because it was a cursed land, if you will. And so just as the Israelites had taken over the farmland of the Canaanites and had gone into a land of milk and honey, the pilgrims came into this land of milk and honey. The pilgrims inhabited the arable land of the Patuxet. Trees had been knocked down. Farmland had been plowed, and just as with the Israelites, the Lord your God Himself pushed them out for their sake. We read in Joshua 23:5, He will drive them out before you, and you will take possession of their land as the Lord your God promised you. Well, when you see these things that happen, you realize why the pilgrims and the Puritans after them referred to this land as New Israel. They believed that the promises that had been made to the Israelites were now being fulfilled in them. One of the challenges that those who studied Scripture at that time had dealt with was there were unfulfilled promises made to Israel. But Israel no longer existed. It had been a millennium and a half since the Jews had been in the land of Israel, and there was no expectation that they would ever be going back. And so they came to the conclusion that God's promises to the descendants of Abraham through Isaac would now be fulfilled in the church. And this covenantal theology then concluded that the church was now the replacement for Israel because the Jews had rejected the Messiah. And so the Christians were children of Israel, or children of Abraham by faith. And so you can understand very reasonably why they would have thought that. Well, it turns out that we do have a double fulfillment of the promises of God. And as they came here, they crossed not the Red Sea and not the Jordan. They crossed the Atlantic, a huge body of water. And they came here, and they came to a land that was incredibly arable and blessed in so many ways. And the Lord had vacated the land before they arrived. And so the Pawtuxet were all gone, it turns out, except for one Indian who they would meet later. Well, their first year there, they didn't know how to farm. Certainly, they arrived in November, so there was no simple way of planting anything. It was cold, and it was not like the warmer climes of Northern Virginia, where they had planned to go, and they had planned to arrive there 6 weeks earlier. So they didn't know how to farm in New England. They had brought seeds, and they planted. Many of the seeds were not appropriate for that area. They couldn't catch fish. In fact, one record indicates they only caught one fish that season. They hunted as they could. They were not very good hunters in that environment. And many of these people were used to being folks who worked with their hands, certainly, but in Holland, which was a civilized country. And then they encountered a great deal of sickness. It was cold. It was a particularly cold and snowy winter. And they had so little food at one point that the daily ration dwindled down to 5 kernels of corn. And they referred to that as their starving time. More than half of the English settlers died during that first winter. Almost every family lost at least one member. And as a result of the poor nutrition and the housing that was grossly inadequate for the freezing cold weather, a very significant portion of the people died. They lived on board the ship as much as they could. They sought to build houses, and they were little more than mud huts. And ultimately, the people just turned to prayer. And only 50 survived the brutal winter. And then an Indian appeared. Now, he was not a Pawtuxet. He was from the Wampanoag tribe. He was a Samoset, or an Indian chief from that tribe. A Sagamore, or an Indian chief from that tribe. And his name was Samoset. And Bradford records that this Indian, who was tall and stood in front of them wearing only a loincloth, walked in very boldly, and he came into this group of pilgrims, and he spoke to them in broken English, but they could well understand, according to Bradford. Nonetheless, they marveled at the fact that here was an Indian who could talk to them. They had run into a few Indians who did not understand English. The best they could do was some sign language before that and communicate to some degree. But here was someone who came in and he said, "Welcome," in perfect English. And then he added this: "Do you have any beer?" Now, a little known secret of history is that the pilgrims carried no water on board the Mayflower. It was presumed that water would make you sick. And historically, and you can find this in many places, water had to be mixed with some alcohol in order to drink it. So Plato, for example, said the proper mixture is 3 waters to 1 wine. And when the Jews came back, when the Israelites came back from having surveyed the land and spied out the land before going into the land of Canaan, you may recall they came back with huge clusters of grapes. Well, nomads can't grow grapes, and the grapes weren't there to get grape juice. The excitement that they had about the grapes was, if you have grapes, you can make wine. If you can make wine, you can purify your water. So it was fundamental to life to have wine. And you'll find that around the world as you look at things historically. So for the pilgrims, the more common thing, particularly on board ship, was beer and to make beer. Well, their beer by now was gone. And so they offered Samoset brandy, which he happily took. And then he sat, spoke with them for a while, And then after he had been talking with them for a bit, he told them that there was another Indian whose name was Squanto, a native of this place, in other words, a Pawtuxet, who had been in England and could speak better English than himself. And it was then that God sent a man. And that is quite often how God addresses the situation where the people are going through great trials and they need someone to lead them, someone to save them. Well, his name was Tisquantum, but they called him Squanto. He was the only living member of the Pawtuxet tribe, having survived, ironically, through the treachery of a captain, Captain Hunt, who had kidnapped him and had carried him and the other braves away to Spain to be sold into slavery. And you can see on the map in the upper right the journeys that Squanto had taken back and forth between Spain, England, Newfoundland, and Massachusetts. In 1605, Squanto had already made a trip to England with another early visitor to Plymouth Harbor, Captain George Weymouth. He had returned to the New World with Captain John Smith when that explorer had mapped the coast of New England. So Squanto was used to really negotiating things for himself. He was a survivor. And when he was sold as a slave in Malaga, he talked his way into the hands of the local friars there, who had decided that he was just an excellent prospect for conversion. So he had the gospel presented to him. We don't know about his faith, but I suspect that he was a believer because he wanted to go to the white man's heaven, and he made that clear to William Bradford before he died. Well, Squanto somehow managed to attach him to an Englishman who was traveling to Spain, Sir Gorges, Gorges, and he got to England. And he was well received by many people there. I mean, you can imagine, here is this Indian in England, and I mean, a lot of people wanted to see the Indians. They had heard about them, and it was a novelty as much as anything else. The person he had attached himself to, Sir Ferdinando Gorges, was head of the council for New England. So he was a reasonably powerful individual and wealthy individual. And he sent Squanto back to his people with a Captain Dermer in 1619. So the year before the Pilgrims arrived. But when he arrived, he discovered that his entire family and his entire tribe had been wiped out by the plague. Okay, so he's the only guy left. You know, Squanto, I believe, is very much like the biblical Joseph. He went through these horrible, horrible situations. He was kidnapped, not just once, but twice sold into slavery. He lost his entire family. Everything happened to him that was the worst you could imagine. And yet, it was those very things that enabled him to be the man that God wanted him to be. And as Joseph said, what you intended for harm, God intended for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. And so he was the agent of the physical salvation of the Pilgrims. And he himself was the miracle. He spoke fluent English. He spoke several Indian tongues so he could translate. So he made it very easy for them to deal with those around. Plus, he understood the customs of the Indians. And so he knew how to negotiate with them. And he knew many of them. He knew the tribes, and he was able to broker peace deals. He also knew the land, and he knew how to live off the land. He was a guide for many of the captains who had come there on other ships. And he wound up being a guide to William Bradford and to the other Pilgrims. But then he trained them in how to farm, how to fish, how to hunt, and he remained loyal to them the entire time. He showed them how to capture eel by walking into the rivers near the ocean and stepping in the mud on the eel and then grabbing the eel. He taught them how to catch the fish. And at one point, they were dealing with the problem of planting, and he was showing them how you plant 5 kernels of corn, and you cut off the fish head, and you put the fish and the corn in the earth, and then for the next 2 weeks, you have to guard it, because otherwise the wolves will come and take the fish heads. And you have to wait until the fish head rots before you can just leave everything there. And he taught them all of these little things that the Indians had learned over years and years and years, and they were able to subsequently plant and farm. And he remained loyal to the Pilgrims throughout. He never turned on them, and the Pilgrims absolutely would not have survived without him. And William Bradford wrote about Squanto that he was a special instrument sent of God for our good, beyond our expectations. They certainly never expected to meet somebody like Squanto, who would come there as a guide. And so then, after that first winter, where they struggled through the starving time, they planted and they worked with Squanto, and he wound up being not only a great translator and communicator, but an expert on resources. And he worked with them to plant and to cultivate so they could prepare for the next winter. And they also were very pleased to discover that corn and squash, which they were used to, were ideally suited for the Massachusetts climate. Well, at the end of that time, after their harvest, sometime between September and November 1621, they demonstrated their gratitude by inviting Squanto and approximately 100 other Indians, Wampanoag Indians, to celebrate their first successful harvest in America. And they feasted on fowl and deer, and then something else that you may not realize, they feasted on popcorn. They had a lot of popcorn, and they had come to understand that if you put corn in the fire, you would get popcorn, and they enjoyed that. And one course was 5 kernels of corn, so that everyone would remember the starving time. Well, Squanto died in 1622. So in November of 1622, Squanto succumbed to a fatal disease. He was serving as a guide to William Bradford at the time, and he was visiting Indians in Monomoy, which is near the modern-day Pleasant Bay. And he wrote this in his journal. In this place, Squanto fell sick. Bradford wrote it in his journal. In this place, Squanto fell sick of an Indian fever, bleeding much at the nose, which the Indians take for a symptom of impending death, and within a few days died there, desiring the governor Bradford to pray for him, that he might go to the Englishman's God in heaven, and bequeath sundry of his things to the sundry of his English friends, as remembrance of his love, of whom they had a great loss. Now, consider this. If the Pilgrims had arrived in 1619, they would have missed Squanto. They would not have made it through the first winter. If the Pilgrims had arrived in 1622, Squanto would have been dead. They would likewise not have survived. And so we see how God took this slender thread, these people who just barely made it here to America, and they had one man that God provided who gave them exactly what they needed. What they needed wasn't food. What they needed was somebody who could show them how to live here. And he trained them in how to live in this new world. And so Romans 8:28, I think, is particularly apropos. And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. There are more little miracles and big miracles, but I think this gives you a sense of how God superintended and planted this little group of people here that ultimately would blossom into this great nation that we have today.